My name is Salim Valimamat, and I'm a lecturer of Catholic University of Angola. I would like to welcome you all to our sixth event of Africa session of this year. The topic of this event is about Africa's outlook for 2021. The event is promoted by the Global Strategic Platform with support of California University and Millennium Foundation in Portugal. As you all may know, the COVID pandemic affected almost all the countries around the world, specifically in the African countries. In that sense, it's very important to discuss the impacts, trends, and challenges in terms of political, economic, and social issues in the African continent. For this, we have today 4 top experts about African issues to discuss. That to our share today, we'll introduce the panel members. The chair of the session is Dr. Akum. Dr. Fonte Akum is the Executive Director Designate at the Institute for Security Studies. He also serves on the UN Development Programs Expert Working Group on the Journeys Out of Extremism. Before joining the ISS, he worked in the research management, and policy communication roles at the Council for Development of Social Science Research in Africa, the UN University for Peace's Africa program, and the International Monetary Fund in Washington. Dr. Fonte's research covers violent conflicts, governance, and borderland dynamics in the West and Central Africa. He has held an MA in American University School of International Service and a PhD from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. Before passing to Dr. Fonte, I also would like to thank the Institute of Security Studies and the Chatham House African Program to support this event today. Dr. Fonte, please, can you make the introduction of the panel and the moderator? I thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Salim. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Depending on where on the globe you're joining us from today, it's an honor and a pleasure to co-chair this 6th Africa session of the Global Strategic Platform. As already articulated by my co-chair, Salim, today we'll be focusing on Africa's outlook for 2021, Africa after COVID-19. This time last year, it was difficult to anticipate with any precision the shroud of uncertainty that the COVID-19 pandemic would throw over humankind. The virus has transformed the ways we live, we work, we travel, and overall the ways in which we relate to one another, from local communities all the way to the United Nations organization. Recent research conducted by the Institute of Security Studies in collaboration with the Gordon Institute for Business at the University of Pretoria and the Pardee Center for International Futures at the University of Denver evidenced 3 orders of effect, which I think we ought to note are interconnected, although they need to be looked at fairly separately. At the first order of implications of COVID-19 in Africa are largely health related. And while the catastrophe that was projected for Africa has not panned out in the health sector, according to the Centers for Disease Control, as of yesterday, Africa had registered over 2.3 million cases with over 55,000 deaths. With South Africa, Morocco, and Egypt registering the highest number of cases. Remarkably, though, the continent has also recorded over 2 million recoveries. Now, for a continent that has dealt with outbreaks of Ebola and cholera occasionally, Africa has proven adept at dealing with COVID-19 at national, regional, and continental levels. However, that remains the tip of the iceberg because the verdict remains out on the real impact of COVID-19 for access to diagnosis and treatment of tropical diseases such as malaria and typhoid, which remain silent killers on the continent. The second order of effects that we saw in the study were mainly socioeconomic in nature. We know that the reductions in GDP growth across Africa today are coupled with reductions in household income, reduced government revenues, and increases in extreme poverty. These are likely to create long-term human development disruptions, with many of the countries on the continent likely set to miss the attainment of most of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And we must not forget the political implications of these socioeconomic pressures as well. You only need to look to Mali, for example, where a president was deposed, and Ethiopia today, where we are seeing a raging war as well in the north, to realize exactly the extent of the peace and security tractations that we are seeing in the background. Now, the third order of implications derive from international flows. An atrophy in the global economy will likely have knock-on effect on overseas development assistance, on foreign direct investment, on foreign aid, and the much needed remittances from diaspora communities. While the pandemic rages on though, advances in science and technology continue to provide a light at the end of the tunnel and provide some kind of optimism. Meanwhile, Africa looks to temper the possible short, medium, and long-term impact of the pandemic, even as there is growing evidence that the continent is currently and slowly entering the dreaded second wave. Today, we would be addressing four key issues. Firstly, we were going to look at the key lessons learned from responses to the COVID-19 pandemic so far. And then the panelists would also look at the question of economic recovery. And beyond economics, what do the geopolitical dynamics look like? And finally, how does the continent consolidate democratic gains, ensure political stability, and sustainable development after COVID? Now, I don't think there is a more distinguished panel that could look at this. Accumulating over a century of experience working on Africa, we have today Wileen A. Johnson, and Wileen is the president of Komaza Incorporated, and she previously served as the U.S. Executive Director on the board of the African Development Bank. She also serves as a consultant and advisor for institutions, national governments, and international organizations on issues relating to finance and development. But she also focuses on peace building and strengthening capacity of the security sector in African countries. We have all the way from London, Alex Vines, who has led the Africa program at Chatham House since 2002 and became managing director for risk, ethics, and resilience in 2019. Welcome, Alex, and thanks for joining us today as well. We have Raymond Gilpin. I would leave Yaki, who's the chairperson of my board of trustees, for last, but not least. Raymond Gilpin is chief economist and head of strategy, analysis, and research team at the Regional Bureau for Africa for the United Nations Development Program in New York. And I've been following Raymond's work for many, many years now. And prior to joining the UNDP, he was the academic dean at the African Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C. And the last but not least of the panelists I would like to introduce this morning is Yaki Cilliers, founder and former executive director at the Institute for Security Studies, and he equally is currently the chairperson of the Board of Trustees, and he heads the African Futures and Innovations Program, which led the research of which I spoke earlier. And his most recent book, Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution, which was released in March 2020, takes a rigorous look at the emerging futures for the continent. We would be hearing from these four panelists. Importantly, though, I would also like to introduce our most distinguished moderator, Assis Malakias, professor and chair of the Department of Global Studies and Maritime Affairs at the California State University Maritime Academy. Assis has a long track record of working on more than just maritime issues, but working on peace and security and economic issues on the continent. With apologies for the last minute absence of the co-moderator, Chico, who unfortunately has a family emergency. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Ashish to go ahead with moderating the session. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ashish.
Thank you, Fonte, and it's a great pleasure to be with you and to moderate this very important session. My first question is to Alex. Alex, what are some of the key insights that we can draw from observing the impact of COVID-19 in Africa? And what could have been done better? And what must decision makers keep in mind going forward?
Thank you very much, Assis. Lovely to see you. And again, thank you to invite me to join this panel this evening. So Fonte has covered a number of the issues in the opening remarks very well, but a few points to make. Firstly is that the mortality rates for Africa on COVID-19 are significantly less than if you look at the Americas. Fonte was talking about 55,000. We see over 600,000 in the Americas, coming up to close to 250,000 in Europe. And so one of the big surprises sitting now looking at this compared with the beginning of the year is that Africa, in terms of the health side of the COVID pandemic, has fared reasonably well. And that was not something that many of us would have expected at the beginning of the year as this virus was spreading. So why is that? What is it that has made Africa different, particularly from Central and South America, I would say, which you'd have thought would be maybe a little bit more similar? And I think there are kind of three things that pop out that were that happened in Africa that they could be learning for the future elsewhere. One is that African governments actually moved pretty quickly in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, not all governments, but many did, and some, like the Rwandan government, or actually the South African government, with lockdowns and very kind of effective civic education, had an impact, I think, in keeping the figures lower. So I think that had an important part to play in including also getting public support for those measures, even if it was at times reluctant. A second one, I think, is the youthful population. I'm sure we'll talk more about demographics on the panel. But I think the youth dividend shows here that there's that the youthful nature of African populations meant that far fewer people have died. I think many may have gotten infected, they may have been asymptomatic, and you may even see situations where we got herd immunity in a number of African countries quite quickly. One thing that is different between Central and South America and Europe, certainly, and Africa is there aren't many kind of homes for seniors, old people's homes. And these are significant locations for infection. We see this in Brazil as we see it in Europe. And I think that may be a difference too, that contributes to understanding that 91% of Africans are under the age of 60. And in Europe, in particular, COVID, in terms of mortality, is an older person's ailment. So I think that's an important understanding. And then I think climate. I think climate does have an element to this in terms of the equatorial areas and maybe also the exposure to other coronaviruses that the African continent has had. Scientists talk to me about places like Senegal having more resilience because there's been other coronaviruses there. I don't know, but we will see as we move along. So these are the reasons that Africa hasn't fitted into the pattern than people were expecting in January, February, March this year, particularly March. Looking forward, what can African governments do better? I think it's the politics of recovery. So the economics, which we'll talk a bit about later, but it's also the politics of vaccines. And this is where I hope Africa doesn't get into being pigeonholed by particular pharmaceutical geopolitics. the key, I think, is about having universal access to vaccine and to ensure that the continent is opened up as quickly as possible, because the devastation of COVID-19 is less on health and it is majorly on economy. And so opening up the African continent again for trade, both internal and external, is, I think, the key learning lesson at this stage that we need to think about. Thank you, Assis.
Oh, thank you, Alex. Thank you. William, this question is for you. The IMF expects sub-Saharan Africa's economy to contract by 3% this year. What steps should African states take to turn this around?
Thank you, Assis, and thank you for the invitation. Although you mentioned 3%, that is an average, and it's not measured on a per capita basis. If we look at the African countries as a whole, the decline has been 5.3% per capita on average. And for individual countries, the losses have been significantly higher. And of course, the economic losses have been the greatest where the economies were the least diversified, with the oil economies suffering significant losses in economic earnings during this period. But there has been a common experience in that at the moment, the countries need to rebuild resilience. I don't know why, maybe because I have too many family members who are engineers, but I always think of a kind of a production function and what you'd call a ratchet function. So we want to put support into the economies. We want to be sure that we don't fall back again and that we can continue on to the long-term growth path. So although the policies will be unique for each country, I think that since all are going through a pandemic, all will want to approach certain issues. First of course, is to continue to strengthen the health systems, especially preventive medicine, public health. And we know that there are some countries, Senegal, Rwanda, and others that have community health systems in place that are particularly important for the communication factor that Alex mentioned in his observations. But we must also reinforce supply chains and invest in local or regional manufacture of medical equipment. I think countries also must assure adequate income. At this time, we are not really talking about stimulus. We're talking about economic support, focusing on the national level. Some of that income will come from debt relief, but that debt relief must be earmarked to free resources for consumption and relief. Once that's done, the policymakers really need to start thinking about how to diversify the markets and the products that they're bringing to market. And finally, I think it's important, even at this early stage, to review and reinforce the preparation for natural disasters and pandemics. Because we've suffered in 2021 does not mean that we will not be hit with a disaster because we've suffered in 2020 doesn't mean we won't face disaster in 2021 and other years. Fortunately, and I think, Alex, one of the reasons for this quick response, fortunately, the African CDC really stepped up very quickly and engaged effectively with the regional organizations in Africa. So it's very important in preparing for the future that those lines of communication that have been opened be maintained and even made an actual regular part of the life of governance. Those coordinating activities will prove to be critical as we face new challenges in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Walleen. Raymond, this question is for you. How would you assess the role of international organizations in Africa during this pandemic?
Thank you very much, Ashish, and thanks to the organizers of Africa Sessions for including me in this very important conversation. There are many unique things about COVID-19 in 2020. One is the globalized nature. So unlike previous health emergencies across Africa, where Africa was the focus for all the attention and the action, this time around, the international community is distracted because the problem is global. But even in that context, we still have seen a lot of international support for Africa on the development front. We see organizations reprogramming resources so that they could meet immediate economic needs. We see a lot of assistance with issues relating to the access to PPEs across Africa. We see a lot of socioeconomic impact assessment documentation, bringing in a wide range of capacities and capabilities to help support African countries. But here's the challenge, Ashish. Most of these interventions or ways in which Africa is being assisted is focusing on the traditional development question. How do we help these developing countries? What COVID has done, it has reversed development in many ways. We see over 30,000 Africans being pushed back into extreme poverty. We see 100 million Africans who now cannot afford pre-COVID safe and sustainable energy. We see 168 million Africans who are food insecure because of COVID. And I can go on with the statistics. My point is that the development challenge that we're facing now requires a reimagined focus on how do we address these issues. And let me just very quickly give one example. And Walleen has mentioned it already, debt service support. The world came together, the G20, and there's a debt service suspension initiative, DSSI. Across Africa, potential debt service savings of $11.2 billion. Good, yes, but not quite, because the DSSI misses out 16 countries that are not low income. All the middle income countries are not covered. The DSSI focuses on a liquidity challenge, not a solvency issue. And for most African countries, it's a solvency problem. It's not that just that they don't have the money to pay their bills right now. It is that structurally, because of the downturn in demand for commodities and supply disruptions for imports, and so Yaki will talk about this later, the macroeconomic impacts of COVID are going to persist for many years. So just a liquidity approach to the debt crisis doesn't quite get us there. And then we also know that because of this persistence, we need an initiative that focuses on the underlying causes and what would trigger the economic transformation that we need post-COVID. So yes, the international community has been engaged. They've been focusing on the immediate problems, but we need to focus on the impacts of reversed development. We also need to find out how we more productively ensure that the humanitarian development nexus is addressed. We don't want to be just looking at the short term without laying the foundation and making the critical investments for longer term. And most importantly, we need to use this as an opportunity to reconstitute the social contract, such that Africa's emerging youth are not seen so much as a ticking time bomb, but as a potential resource. A lot of Africa's growth is going to be consumer-based. If it's only going to focus on a really small segment of the population who have access to government contracts, etc., we're not going to be able to have the sort of sustainable and expansive growth that we're looking for. UNDP published a report called Beyond Recovery Towards 2030, which looks at a comprehensive approach to this that has 4 pillars: social protection, the green economy, digital disruption, and governance. I think as an international community, we need to be seeing how could we synergize and sustain assistance so that the post-COVID is not just about recovering from a health crisis, but it's about economic transformation and getting back on track to attain the SDGs. Thank you, Ashish.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Yaki, what weaknesses, especially in terms of governance, has the health crisis exposed on the continent? And what must be done to address these weaknesses?
Thank you, Ashish. We have a tremendous thunderstorm here in Pretoria, so if you lose me, then my apologies. I think on the one side, COVID sort of reminds me of a bit of climate change. Of course, the one is slow moving and the other one very rapid. And the commonality for me is that Africa played no role in the pandemic, but we will suffer most. Not in terms of fatalities, as Fonte and others have mentioned, but because of the economic impacts. So we have less resilience and capacity to withstand the shocks. And we've already, I think Raymond and others have mentioned the point that Africa has done quite well in responding to COVID, not only because we have a young population with low mortality, but because we have the experience of pandemics like HIV/AIDS, Ebola, and so on. But we must not underestimate the impact that still lies ahead. I think there was previous mention of the IMF forecast of IMF growth forecast. Now, I think the average expectation for growth in 2020 is a contraction of about 3.7%. So it's a difference of about 6.5 percentage points to what the IMF forecast ahead of the growth of COVID. Now in 2021, we expect growth in Africa on average to rebound to about 3%. Originally, I think the expectation was that there was going to be a bounce in 2021. But that really required the rollout of vaccines at the end of 2020, which is not going to happen. And rollout of vaccines and inoculation programs are going to take a significant amount of time for a range of reasons. But because the mortality in Africa is so low, it will have less of an impact. But because our economic recovery largely depends on recovery in the rest of the world, the impacts are going to be significant. On the one side, because we have large trade with China, rapid recovery there will help. But on the other side, our trade with the European Union is still much larger than with the single country China. And the slow recovery in the EU will have quite an impact on Africa. So we estimate that the African economy next year will be about $228 billion smaller than the pre-COVID estimate. Now that is a significant figure. So instead of a African economy that in 2019 we thought would be about $3 trillion, it's going to be about $2.75 trillion. And we must remember that the African population increases by about 35 million people every year. So generally, we're going to see a contraction in GDP per capita. This year, we thought that our estimations is that it contracted by about $335 and next year, probably it will contract by about $280 compared to a pre-COVID forecast. Now, in the African context, this is substantive, in particular, because government revenues will decline. And because government revenues will decline, African governments will have less capacity. And our estimation is that government expenditure will contract by about $91 billion in 2021. That is a lot of money that would have gone to basic infrastructure, education, rollout of electricity, jobs, and so on and so forth. So it also means that military expenditure will decline. That means there's less security, there's less peacekeepers, there's more room for terrorists and criminals, and so on and so forth. It will imply probably a setback in the fight against terror, and so on. And this is all happening at a time that international support for the UN and peacekeeping is in decline. So all of this means that we really need to focus on the structural transformations towards higher growth. And I'll just list four, and there are many. And this is the importance of a manufacturing transition in Africa, trade integration and the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, leapfrogging through technology, and of course, the importance of improved governance across the continent. And I assume we will unpack some of that a bit later in this discussion.
Thank you very much, Yaki. Let's go to the second round. And in this second round, I'd like to get your insights, your opinions on the post-COVID economic recovery. And my first question is to Alex. Alex, the global economic recovery will depend on the swift and reliable delivery of a vaccine. In previous global health crises, Africa was not necessarily placed at the front of the queue. How can African leaders ensure that the same urgency that we are seeing in places like the United States and Europe is also felt in Africa? And also, what would be the economic consequences for Africa of delays in delivering the vaccine?
Thank you, Assis. So COVID, I think, has made countries look at Africa, even at this stage, and consider what is its strategic value. So certainly my sense in Europe is that COVID has focused European policymakers on that their supply chains, some of them, were overstretched and we're vulnerable, and that the nearest continent to Europe is Africa, and that actually that it may make sense in the future to shorten supply chains and focus manufacturing and investment, including FDI, on a continent that is a neighbor, that is a near abroad. And I think we will see, particularly in West Africa, more action in this regard, which is not only tied to peace and security, the issues that Yaki was mentioning, but is to do with foreign direct investment and developing industrial base. There is a debate about encouraging pharmaceutical production over the next 15, 20 years within West Africa, for example, including with an eye for then exporting into Europe, but with a cheaper cost base. So these are the sorts of things that policymakers are already thinking about. In the short term, there is also a global competition, I think, emerging of politics of generosity. So who will be the most generous humanitarian? And I think this is there'll be with the Biden administration, with President-elect Biden, we'll probably see the United States entering this also, and that is an opportunity in terms of the rolling out of vaccines for the continent, be they the AstraZeneca University of Oxford vaccine or Sputnik 5. And even there is now conversation about blending some of these vaccines for effectiveness. So Sputnik 5 with the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, which don't need the very low temperatures for storage that the first generation of vaccines that have been being validated at the moment carry. This is an opportunity for African leaders to use their agency and for Africa CDC to, as Wilhelm has rightly pointed out, to try and coordinate and insist that there is true generosity and universal access to these vaccines. I agree completely with Yaki that to unlock the economic rebound for the continent, although Africans are less impacted in terms of mortality rates, convincing and opening up African markets, having comprehensive vaccination campaigns will be really helpful to try and get a quicker rebound economically. So I think this politics of generosity is absolutely central. And I think next year we will see a number of key African summits. There are key summitries taking place with international partners where this will become quite prominent. So, for example, the next FOCAC summit is in Dakar next year, and I think this will be visible there, this whole discourse from China. But there are also the deferred EU-AU summit in Brussels. That will be next year. Again, this will be a theme there. And the India-Africa Forum was also deferred from this year. So I think we'll see these international summits in partnership with Africa as being moments of stock taking, but also of headlining partnerships, including on global health and how to work with Africa in terms of COVID recovery.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. William, 2021 may very well be a year of transition back to economic health. But it also seems that most African states will continue to require various support measures. What should be the fiscal and monetary priorities for African countries?
Well, I think the first and perhaps most important step will be to shift strategy from support to stimulus. Countries will continue their efforts to support their countries, but they have to get back to growth. And perhaps the best way is to continue these efforts at participatory budgeting that have started to take hold in different parts of the continent, supported by organizations such as the Open Budget Partnership and others, where we have real guidelines on how to bring the public into the process of defining priorities, and perhaps even more important, to bring them into the process of evaluating and monitoring outcomes. Fiscal expenditures will continue to focus on issues related to health, but also will include new or perhaps suspended infrastructure investments. Water and sanitation, they are related to health, but they're very important. In terms of other types of investments, roads and transportation, ports and others, those and the supply chains related to them must be extended within the context of the African continental free trade area, and also some potential new supply chains that such as those that Alex mentioned in his comments. Now, the monetary authorities are not necessarily going to have an easy time. And as a former central banker, I'm well aware that they're going to face two major risks. One is one we haven't seen in a while, and that may be inflation, not only related to the disruption in supply chains, but the fact that countries will turn to domestic resource mobilization for borrowing. That has to be done judiciously so that we don't get into that cycle of inflation, and which inevitably leads to decline in the exchange rate, which will then make the external borrowing even more expensive. The other risk that they face is that if there is not economic stimulus and the return to consumption and activities, then the banking system may begin to face the burden of non-performing loans. And we will add a financial strain or financial crisis to the existing health-related crisis. So the monetary authorities and their regulatory friends need to be very diligent moving ahead. And communication will continue to be important because all of this must be done in a way that inspires confidence and therefore limits the prospects or the risk of inflation and devaluation.
Thank you very much, Wileen. Raymond, the pandemic impacted the global economy's demand for resources, reducing exports of commodities such as oil. How can African nations develop or accelerate much needed diversification plans to increase resilience in times of external shocks?
Thank you so much, Ashish. I think it was former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill who said, "You never waste a good crisis." I think the COVID crisis has a lot of downsides, but one of the positives is that it gives us an opportunity to rethink and reimagine a lot of things that we need to do. And one of them has to do with this issue of economic diversification. Africa is one of the, I think, the only continent that its economic structure relative to primary commodities, manufacturing, and services has not evolved as much as the others have. And this is usually highlighted as one of the, as a main characteristic of underdevelopment, and hence the need to diversify out of some of the commodities into others. But there's a challenge there. I think this is where we all agree collectively to throw most of the textbooks out, because the textbooks have a pretty linear view when it comes to economic diversification. You go from primary production, then you get to manufacturing, then you get to services. It doesn't happen that way anymore. If you look at most of the East Asian tigers, etc., it was not just an issue of leapfrogging, but it was an issue of redefining the space. And so I think the first thing we have to recognize is that for most African countries, their endowment is our commodities. And the question then becomes, how do you diversify within the sector initially, because that's what you have, before you start thinking about how you diversify horizontally. And diversifying within the sector has a lot to do with this issue of value chain analysis. How do we ensure that more of the value of these commodities not just stay within African countries, but are distributed in a way that enhances further beneficiation within the economies? There's quite a lot of work that's led by a Chilean economist, Cesar Hidalgo, and he looks at the issue of economic complexity, where he uses artificial intelligence to look at a number of data points that explain not just what makes particular economies complex, but how that complexity relates to trade and economic partnerships that could enhance production and help push development forward. And this is not the textbook diversification story. It is, let us look at the political economy, let's look at the key players, let's look at the various supply and value chains and see how to position economies in a way that makes sense for the 21st century. That, I think, is important, because once we start thinking that way, and then we're seeing not just how we improve the volume and the value of exports, but how we ensure that the benefits of trade get to those who are responsible for production a lot quicker, rather than a lot of the intermediaries and a lot of the leakages with which we are very familiar. And it's in this context that we have to think about the Africa Continental Free Trade Arrangement. Because for most African countries, even if tomorrow we are able to diversify into manufacturing and services, market entry globally will take some time. But if there are ways to ensure that the African market, which is huge in itself, can begin to provide market access and market entry for the sorts of economic complexity related activities that Africa decides to take as a continent and as constituent countries, then we start, looking at the possibilities within the context of the fourth industrial revolution. And all the pieces of the jigsaw start coming together. Because this is important. Concluding, it is not just an issue for policy wonks and governments. We need the private sector, the business sector, in on this as well. And here's where I will highlight some work that's been done at the Said Business School at Oxford in partnership with Mars Corporation. And they have talked about something called the economics of mutuality. How you ensure that businesses and communities and society are able to ensure enhanced output and performance in a way that meets critical needs at the corporate level, at the government level, and at societal levels, while at the same time respecting the environment. And so I think we have to unpack this diversification question and go beyond our traditional textbooks to see how we can use what we have, resource endowment, technology, digital and artificial intelligence, to inform us in a way that ensures that we don't just see GDP growing, but see GDP growing in a way that brings most, if not all, of the population along at the same time. Thank you.
I thank you. Thank you very much. Yaki, this next question is for you. You recently written a book, Africa First, that focuses on how the continent can translate potential into prosperity. What is the role of the human resources in translating this potential to prosperity?
Thank Assis. I must say I was really listening intently. I really loved Alex's point about the politics of generosity and or competition in the politics of generosity. Let's hope that happens. And they're very interested by what Raymond just said about diversification within the commodity sector. Very interesting, I think. Because I'm not an economist, but the bit of work that I've done on the long-term future of Africa tells me, when I look at comparative studies, and this does relate to the question you've asked, many of us argue that agro-processing is the way through which to go up the value chain. Africa has never tried agriculture. We talk a lot about it, but we've never actually invested in it. And services today, low-end services in informal urban areas is the dominant sector in Africa. And Raymond, some of your former colleagues have done a lot of work about industry, in Washington, a lot of work on sort of industries without smokestacks, at Brookings and so on. And I'm fascinated by this remark about the economics of mutuality, because the reality is that the African economies are not complex. They're actually very simple economies. So I'm wondering how you apply this complexity and mutuality to the African context. This is certainly an issue of debate. Now, in the book Africa First, I modeled the impact of various interventions, in actual fact 11 interventions on the long-term future of Africa with a horizon to about 2040. So modeled the impact of getting to Africa's demographic dividend and agricultural revolution, better investments in basic infrastructure such as leapfrogging, the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area, the impact of climate change, the future of jobs, and a variety of things. And each of these, what we did is we looked at what would be an aggressive or an ambitious positive scenario compared to where we think Africa is headed. And we used the forecasting tool hosted and developed at the University of Denver for this. And then eventually we put all of this together and we looked at what is possible for Africa. So that's quite a big difference to the kind of blue skies thinking of where we want Africa to be, as opposed to what is possible. And there's often quite big differences. Now, there are three factors that in traditional economics, and I'm not an economist, contribute to growth: labor, capital, and technology. And Africa trails significantly on all three. Now, you've largely asked me about labor contribution that human capital makes. Now, over long time horizons, investments in human capital in labor are the most enduring contribution to sustainable economic growth over long time horizons. And the continent obviously has to invest in the associated enablers. Now, the first is that we have a very large and growing working age population. Working age population ages 15 to 64. And in actual fact, by about 2037, our size of our working age population relative to our total population will be larger than the European Union. And by mid-century, it will be larger than that of North America. That is the percent of people aged 15 to 64 as a portion of the adult population. So we potentially have a large labor force, and it has the potential to accelerate economic growth, provided we can invest in the associated skills base. That's particularly education, but also getting more rapidly to our demographic dividend. We only get to our demographic dividend around mid-century, which is when this relationship becomes optimal. We have such a young population that for the next 3 decades, our very rapid and high population growth rates, in actual fact, are a constraint on growth. But that, of course, declines every passing year. We spent a lot of time looking at what is the impact of improved education on better access to water and wash infrastructure and so on. And we can look at the impact of these. And I think that the sum of a lot of the work that I've done is a little bit disheartening on the one sense, because it tells you that you have to get the basics right. If you don't invest in education, and Africa trails substantively, the gap, things are improving in Africa, but the gap has remained constant for the last 3-4 decades. If you don't invest in your basic infrastructure and so on and so forth, you will never really catch up. And the gap between averages of, for example, GDP per capita in Africa and the rest of the world continues to increase. Things are improving in Africa, but the gap continues to grow. So really a lot needs to change. Now, Raymond I'll conclude with 2 points. The first is eventually what Africa needs is strong developmentally minded governments that regulate and empower and support the small and medium businesses and the private sector, which is the primary wealth and employment creator in the 21st century. There's no doubt about that. But at low levels of development, where poor countries find themselves, 27 or countries in Africa, or low-income countries, the nature of that governing elite is very important, because the private sector only becomes a real facilitator of growth when you become a middle-income country. So these two issues, governance and the role of the private sector, are going to be hugely important. Unless COVID serves as a real wake-up call for the importance of translating our commitment to much more rapid rates of economic growth, we will not be able to grow ourselves out of this challenge. And as we think we'll come to, growth is the more important, literally almost than anything else, economic growth in the years to come. Sorry, I got a bit carried away there, but very interesting.
That's quite all right. I'd like to shift the conversation just a little bit beyond economics to capture some of the geopolitical dynamics. And I'd like to invite Alex to comment on some of the changes that are happening here in the United States and how that will affect Africa. Alex, President-elect Joe Biden is, of course, about to take office. Do you expect major U.S. policy changes towards Africa under the Biden presidency? What improvements in the relationship with the U.S. should African leaders attempt to secure?
Thanks, Assis. You're probably better placed to answer this than I am, honestly, but there you go. Well, look, the whole tone will be different. There won't be four-letter word derogatory remarks about Africans by the president. That's not going to happen. A Biden administration will work tremendously hard diplomatically within the African continent. There won't be massive long time lags for appointment of ambassadors. The instruments of the US state for diplomacy, trade, and other things will be much more focused in terms of outreach and partnership. So the whole mood music will be different. The key question, I think, is what can the US achieve with existing resources? In that the majority of the Biden administration's first few years will be about domestic COVID recovery and dealing with the legacies of the Trump administration. So within that, therefore, how does existing US diplomacy, be it aid, trade, security, how can that be more effective in the African continent? And I think that's going to be the major challenge for the Biden administration. So how to curate that and make that more effective? And I'm sure there will be some good ideas, but we have to be realistic. There's not going to be a lot more money on the table. It's not going to be there. So it's about using what's already there more effectively. There will, I think, be some reversals on Trump-era policy. So US security forces withdrawing from Somalia, I think that will be reversed. I don't know the statement this week of the Trump administration recognizing Morocco's claim to Western Sahara, for example. I'm not sure how that's going to be handled. One important change that I anticipate very early on in a Biden administration is the change of the visa restrictions on the so-called Muslim visa ban. So Africans from Tanzania, Somalia, Nigeria, Eritrea, and Sudan may well find it easier again to apply to visit to the United States. So that's, I think, a low-hanging fruit policy opportunity for a Biden administration. Moving forward, I think the US will be looking at alliances. So there are going to be some things that will be continuity from a Trump administration. And this is where we get again into into geopolitics, the containing particularly of China and Russia in Africa will be a continuity issue. But what you will see is, I think, the US administration under Biden looking for progressive alliances with Western countries, Japan and others, in terms of the politics of containment. Now, again, the challenge for Africans will be how to navigate this, not to get pigeonholed, not to find that either you're seen to be involved with one country, be it Russia or China, to the exclusion of the West. So it's the politics of diversification. Yaki and others have talked about economic diversification, but what I think is going to be very important in coming years is how African politicians and leaders navigate the geopolitics that is going to be becoming even more intense. So those are my kind of initial thoughts. I'm hopeful that also that we probably will see in the Biden administration will certainly look at a legacy issue on Africa, just like previous presidents, except Mr. Trump has done. And we'll see. You know, something. We've had Power Africa, we've had PECFAR. It's too early to say what the legacy will be for Biden, but I'm sure there will be an initiative that is designed as a legacy issue of a Biden administration with its partnership with the African continent.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Alex. The politics of containment. It seems like George Kennan will never go out of style. Willeen, we can't really talk about geopolitics and Africa without bringing China into the conversation. Africa's relationship with China is both wide-ranging and complex, but one of the main aspects are the extensive loans provided by Beijing. During this crisis, concerns have been raised about the debt sustainability. Could this lead to China cutting back on lending to Africa, Willeen?
I think it is very likely that China will reduce its lending to Africa, but by raising the issue of debt sustainability, you're focusing on the African countries. I'd like to shift a little bit just to look at China itself and the role that it has played. It's remarkable. China has been a strategic actor on the world stage, and it's transformed itself from a developing country into a global power within a few decades. Now, this transformation into a manufacturing powerhouse led to an increased demand for raw materials. That, in turn, led China to launch an aggressive lending program, specifically aimed at helping countries to have projects that were designed to increase the production of oil and other commodities, which in turn would satisfy China's need. What is particularly interesting is that just in the last week, the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University released a data set on China's overseas development finance. And it looked specifically at the two policy banks, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. In looking at those loans, you see that China has actually lent $462 billion to African countries between 2008 and, well, no, not to African countries, to globally, to the world, between 2008 and 2019. Now, that's about equal to the lending portfolio of the World Bank. So China has definitely taken on a major role. However, its lending has been focused and strategic, responding as much to China's own growth strategy as to the demands or interests of the borrowing countries. China's already cut back on the global lending, but the Boston University database shows, although it shows that 2009 was the peak for global lending, it also shows that the lending to the African countries increased after that period, in part because of the role that the African countries are playing in this China Belt and Road initiative. But it is likely that lending to African countries will decline as these individual countries reach their own limits of sustainability in terms of their debt burden, and also as China refocuses. China has been in the process of rebalancing, moving from an export-led economy to one that will be driven by domestic demand. The events of COVID, with China returning to capacity, to productive capacity, while others have still been struggling, means that this year, that export role continued to be very important. But looking forward, we're likely to see China more interested in its internal issues and satisfying its internal credit needs. Also, I think another reason why we might see a decline is that the record provided by this database shows that many of those loans violated environmental and human rights standards. China is definitely moving to assume a leadership role on the global stage and may become reluctant to disregard global norms as we move forward.
Thank you so very much, Walleen. Raymond, bringing it to, I guess, the continental geopolitics, the pandemic has demonstrated again the need for greater regional cooperation in Africa. How can continental cooperation be strengthened? And how can this enhance Africa's position vis-a-vis other regions in the global arena, as well as international organizations such as the UN?
Thank you so much, Ashish. I'd like to attempt to answer this by going back to a couple of things that Yaki brought up. He does make excellent points about the nature of African economies and about our thinking about how we could harness complementarities where they do exist. I think the complexity data is important because it goes beyond our usual focus on the fundamentals of comparative or competitive advantage to include some other issues like non-tariff barriers, political considerations, standards, and other factor endowments. Because if you think about it, take in West Africa, quite a number of the large hotels in West Africa buy their chicken from Brazil. And you wonder, is there no chicken in West Africa? The issue is being able to calibrate the data so you could know exactly where you could invest in those capacities so you do make the savings, because without that understanding, you might start a chicken farm in country X, but it's just not productive, and not just for economic and financial reasons, but for a host of other some political economy, some societal reasons. So I do think that even though the economies may not be as sophisticated, the factors influencing the economies are complex enough for us to start thinking about how could we do this in a way that not only creates a profit and boosts GDP productivity, but ensures that there is more equitable distribution within the economies. To start creating that constituency for change and to start creating the preconditions for enhanced state-society relations, and the lack of which is at the basis of a lot of the law and order issues that we seek to address. And so we have to think about, development and progress from a regional basis for these reasons. The mutuality issue is that we have, for the last 3 decades, been talking about value chain analysis, talk about social investments, social responsibility, social corporate responsibility, but never really looked at it from how do we make it more organic within the way we do business. And I think this could go both in, domestically and regionally, and so that within the business model itself, you have intentional policy action to create jobs, because jobless growth is not sustainable growth. And I think that's what we really need to look at. And so Africa is a continent of some 55 countries. You look at Africa across the globe. Most of the economies are really small. They really can't stand. A number of them are landlocked. You have the small island states. And so a regional approach is imperative. Here, key to giving a little bit more impetus to this regionalism has to be the African Union's principle of subsidiarity, where the African Union has the overarching responsibility, but then it delegates, so to speak, responsibility to the smaller regional entities. But what does that mean today? Because if it's only delegation on paper and there is no real game plan to strengthen, empower, facilitate at the sub-regional level, and then we're not really connecting the dots. So I think we really have to revisit subsidiarity. What does it mean in a post-COVID building forward sense, so that we could be able to make progress? Second thing is that a lot happens in what we in UNDP call Africa's borderlands. The border regions are very important because even though one country might start somewhere on the map and another one continues, the cultural and economic links make those borderlands really fluid. And because of that, we really do need to have a special effort at the sub-regional level to recognize some of the peculiar challenges being faced in the borderlands. A recent study of COVID in West and Central Africa that looked at 35 checkpoints in West and Central Africa found over 33,000 Africans stranded in borderlands because of COVID related requirements. They either cannot afford to take the test to be able to produce a certificate across the border, or just the bureaucracy makes it difficult. And so there has to be a regional approach to the borderlands to ensure that we are incorporating that in this. We've talked earlier about the role of the African CDC in getting ahead of COVID in Africa. That should be like that should be an example that we replicate. And now we will be unveiling the Continental Free Trade Agreement in January. We do have a secretariat in Ghana. Is it empowered? Does it have what it needs to succeed? And I think that we have to, revisit regional considerations and regionalism, so to speak, from that context. Thank you.
I thank you. So, Yaki, the global geopolitics dynamics will continue to revolve around technological races. How can African states position themselves to benefit and gain competitive advantages through technological advances such as 5G technology?
Thanks, Assis. In earlier work that I did a few years ago, we made the argument that Africa's growth trajectory is most likely to emulate that of India. It will largely be services-led, low-end services. It'll be chaotic bottom-up. It'll be despite government. It'll be quite corrupt. We need to change all of that, in my view. Historically, as we know, manufacturing has been the growth model that the Asian tigers and everybody else has followed. And services have only really driven growth at much higher levels of income, like in the US, which is a services-led economy, but very extraordinarily productive and a very different structure to where Africa is. As I said previously, what you have in Africa is you have low-end services in the informal sector that often dominates. Now, in my view, the impact of COVID is in actual fact that it will potentially unlock productivity growth in services. Thus far, technology has unlocked productivity growth in manufacturing, but that's stalled. That gave rise to great value chains and all of these kind of things over time. But I think that what we now see shifts in productivity that on the one side, and we will also see that technology will and geopolitical competition will see the relocation of value chains and particularly manufacturing. Alex referred to this, and we will see not only to some degree the reshoring of manufacturing, but the relocation of manufacturing, partly away from China to surrounding countries, but also possibly to Africa, but also because the cost of manufacturing is declining. We may see the capital investment, we may see that manufacturing locations shift closer to the consumer, and as Cesar, you and others have mentioned, large growing market in Africa. But this is a section where we speak geopolitics, and I think there's no doubt that COVID has generally accelerated the ascent of China compared to the rest of the world. It's simply growing much more rapidly. It's recovering more rapidly. Power shifts as their economy grows more rapidly. Even as China becomes more inward-looking, it remains important for Africa, particularly because it helped to alleviate our infrastructure deficit. So when we speak of technology, I want to go back to the basics that I referred to previously. So when we speak of technology, we like to refer to 5G and all of these kind of things. They are important. But Africa is, having made all these points about manufacturing, what technology allows Africa to do is to roll out the basics more rapidly. And those basics are firstly the provision of household electricity, which we can do through renewables, mini and off-grid systems. Without electricity, without basic household electricity across the entire continent, we can't provide the next big enabler for leapfrogging, which is access to the World Wide Web and the internet. Now, many companies are rolling out broadband access across Africa, satellites, blimps, cables around the continent, and so on and so forth. But without, firstly, electricity, secondly, internet access, we cannot have the leapfrogging in education and all of these other really important enablers that would allow Africa to move. None of this is possible without substantive external investment, which is the other large enabler. I think direct investment flows to sub-Saharan Africa is only about 2%, 2.7% of GDP. It's about half the rate, for example, of Europe and so on and so forth. And again, this requires, if we want to get inward investment, we need to move forward, as Raymond and others have mentioned, with the presentation of a larger market, the African Continental Free Trade Area, that will attract the private sector and capital to invest, and that sees Africa as an attractive investment potential. So there are a lot of moving parts that need to come together, but I think when we speak of technology, leapfrogging, all of these things, it's really about the ability of modern technology to provide many of the basics in Africa, basic infrastructure, electricity, water, sanitation, medical services, that can really make, I think, the difference rather than the 5G and all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yaki. Point very well taken. I want to then move to the final round, which touches on how to ensure political stability and sustainable development after COVID. And again, I'd like to start with Alex by asking this question, Alex. The health and economic crisis presented by COVID-19 also represent a political challenge in many African countries. Lockdowns and food shortages have caused unrest in several states. Can these events pressure governments to act in more accountable and democratic ways?
Thank you. I mean, Raymond has already talked about this in his presentation by talking about the need to build the social contract, to rebuild it. And one of the worries about what we've been seeing in the continent is a regression, a weakening, an eroding away in many cases of that contract. You yourself, Assis, I think, or was it? No, it was Fonte mentioned the coup in Mali. I mean, the problem is that we're working with entities, I mean, states that, for many of the populations within them, the state is illegitimate. There is no social contract. Government is seen as predatory. And this is going to be a massive challenge of how to address that, given the need to provide public goods and to get growth and employment and opportunity and equity. If you look at the continent in 2020, in terms of democratic advances in the continent, just looking at it through that lens, I think I probably can put up my fingers for 3 advances that I saw this year. Malawi, massive surprise with a court decision to have a rerun of a presidential election there. The Seychelles, where an opposition party for the first time, or an opposition candidate, wins the presidency since independence in 1977 or 76. And obviously the very, fiercely fought election that's just happened in Ghana, and the winning by an incumbent for a second term. But then compare that with what happened in Mali, or the reporting that we've had in Tanzania of the elections there. And I can give many other examples, and that's just one indices. This worries me very greatly. So to use the phrase that's been bounded in Europe and North America about how do you build back better, building up institutions and governance and local and regional accountability is going to be absolutely key for moving forward, as I can see it. I don't know what, Assis, you or Raymond or Yaki, if we'd said that there was a war going on in Ethiopia right now, and we were having this meeting this time last year, would we have predicted that? Not sure. And this goes to, I think, the urgency of finding better accountable leadership and ensuring that that moving forward, it's much less about personality politics, and it is about institutions and checks and balances. This remains, for me, one of the big challenges for the continent. And the amount of time and thinking that the Institute for Security Studies or my own institute has put into this, we still do not come up with solutions here. It's one of the more bleak parts of reading Yaki's book, is thinking about this particular issue of how to move forward. So, you know, I don't want to be the Grinch that steals Christmas here, Assis, but you know, this is a sobering conversation when we talk about these issues.
Sobering indeed. Willeen, there's a direct link between transparency, accountability, the rule of law, and political stability. How can international and regional stakeholders ensure progress in terms of good governance in Africa?
Assis, you know, we've been working at this for decades, but I think there is some momentum growing to assure good governance in Africa. Of course, it has to also be a world where there's good governance in other places, particularly the places where those who have siphoned illicit funds from Africa and placed them abroad. So I think one role that external stakeholders can play is to see that law enforcement and bank regulators in the global financial centers deploy the already existing tools that they have to counter money laundering. Access to these international banks facilitates grand corruption and also allows those corrupt actors to amass large funds. But these funds are not only used for self-aggrandizement, they have been important tools for financing conflict in Africa. Many of the militia, whether it's in the DRC or other parts of Africa, are funded through bank accounts in London and other financial centers. We also need to have transparency and ownership. And I laugh because there are not only problems in terms of identifying some of the assets in banks. Those of you who are in Nairobi know that there are great herds of cattle who are not necessarily owned by the people who are urging them along. So there has been tremendous innovation in ways of hiding assets and ill-gotten gains. And I think it behooves all of us to put our heads together to be sure that there's transparency and ownership, and that we also require our political leaders to be transparent in their financial disclosure forms when they enter government, while they're in government, and when they leave government. So transparency is absolutely critical. And what we've seen is that the COVID has revealed gross weaknesses in many aspects of our economic life, but particularly in terms of procurement. In the US, we've had terrible problems with companies claiming that they could supply protective equipment and clearly not having the capacity to do that. And the scramble for medical and protective equipment also propelled African governments and medical services to enter into contracts with firms who didn't have the capacity. International partners should continue to work with African countries to assure that there are rigorous standards of procurement and that there are ways of including a verification of credit worthiness and productive capacity of suppliers when they're bidding for contracts. Now, to our great pleasure, firms within Africa have proven to be innovative manufacturers of needed material, and they should be welcomed into international supply chains once they have met the local needs. Again, we have to view this as a partnership and recognize that the shortfalls in terms of governance have been global, not just in Africa. And to overcome these problems associated with poor governance, it will take a global effort.
Thank you so much, Wileen. Raymond, how important are policy frameworks that integrate poverty reduction with growth objectives for African countries? Specifically, what needs to be included in such frameworks?
Thank you, Ashish. I think the question highlights a very important point, that there is a link between poverty and also macroeconomic growth. But that link is great, but it's not sufficient. Because what we see is that even with growth, the benefits of growth don't trickle down as broadly and as quickly as we would all like. And so there are 5 things I'd just like to highlight very quickly that I think should be included. The first is the issue of jobless growth, that there has to be some intentional investments to ensure that, whether it is through value chain entry points or corporate engagements, to ensure that Africa's growth does also translate into jobs for most people. Because without jobs, we would not, everything from economic to environmental to political stability gets undermined. And so the first has to be on the employment side. And this has to be beyond the registered part of the labor force. The unregistered side of the labor force, which we usually call the informal sector, but which I prefer to call the non-formal sector, we need to have policies that integrate the non-formal sector and provide them the protections and the access that they need, not just to survive, but also to scale up. The second thing on the macroeconomic front that has to be done to ensure that we do have good poverty outcomes is we need equal growth. We see growth in sectors that are male-dominated have a different outcome from growth in sectors that are female-dominated. We cannot ignore half of our labor force. Half of Africa is female. And so we do have to have a gendered policy view. And what does this mean? It does mean specific programs that make it easier for women not just to start jobs, but to keep jobs and to scale jobs up. And this has to include interventions, not just in terms of education and skills, but also in terms of financial services and credit. Third, we need to have sustainable growth. Having growth that includes activities that destroy the environment is not good. Not just for the environment, but for Africa's development prospects. Looking at whether it's agriculture or mining in a way that makes the land or the ecosystem unusable, subsequently, is just not acceptable, because the net effect will be negative in the communities. Fourth, we need to move away from narrow growth. The growth in Africa so far has been narrow, not just sectorally, but narrow in terms of beneficiaries. We see small elites, not just becoming middle class, but becoming super middle class. And that is not, I think, good for the continent. I think that we need to find ways to broaden it out. So everything from fiscal instruments to including taxation, more progressive taxation has to be considered, but also ways that you ensure that ways you ensure that the rest of the economy can actively and productively participate. And this includes not just banking, but communications, but also access to markets. And fifth, it has to be integrated growth. We talk about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. That is wonderful. But the reality is that for most of Africa's exports, we do have contracts, or we do have firms that deal with the rest of the world. And how do we ensure that Africa's growth is integrated more effectively and more fully into the global economy? So when we think not just in terms of returns, but also investment, that Africa becomes a more meaningful player in this context. And so, again, reimagining a growth that is poverty, that is not poverty enhancing, we have to do different with the labor market. We have to address inequalities, sustainability, and just a quick plug. The United Nations Development Program will be launching its Human Development Report 2020 on the 15th of December, next Tuesday. And its focus is on a new way to address this issue of the impact we're having on the planet and how we could ensure that poverty reduction and growth are very focused on not just profits, but also the planet and sustainability. And lastly, the political economy of growth has to deal with this growing gulf between and deepening gulf between the elites and the rest of society.
Thank you very much, Raymond. We'll certainly look forward to reading that report. Iñaki, the last question is for you. The pandemic hindered progress towards the attainment of many sustainable development goals in Africa. What needs to be done for African countries to get back on track?
Thanks, Assis. Very interesting conversations and debates that I think we can engage in. Now, our estimate is that in this year, 2020, about an additional about 17 million Africans could be classified as being below $1.90 or extremely poor because of COVID, compared to a pre-COVID forecast. And that next year, 2021, an additional 31 million Africans will probably be classified as extremely poor compared to pre-COVID forecasts. So by 2030, when we reach SDG Goal 1, about 1/3, 33% of Africans will probably be extremely poor if we carry on as we are carrying on. That is equivalent to about 580 million Africans out of a total population of 1.7 billion. When we speak of poverty in 2030, we will largely be speaking about sub-Saharan Africa. And we only see the increase in extreme poverty in absolute numbers starting to decline from about 2034 onwards. So that's where we are at the moment on our current trajectory. And the only way out of this is rapid economic growth. Yes, it needs to be sustainable and all those nice things that Raymond says. But I wonder, I want to use South Africa as a bit of an example of what not to do. We are the most unequal country in the world. We have the highest levels of unemployment in the world. We have an extremely progressive tax system. We have 18 million out of 60 million South Africans on social grants. We have a government who has prioritized, except for one brief period, this redistribution as opposed to growth. Yet the only time that South Africa managed to reduce unemployment was in a period about 1996 to 1999, period that Thabo Mbeki was the president. And what he did is he focused on a few fundamentals, basics. So my response to all of these nice things are, yes, we need inclusive, gender equitable, nice growth in the formal sector, but we need growth. Without growth, nothing else is possible. I'm simplifying things. We expect average growth in Africa of 3.1% next year, 3.1% average for all of Africa's 55 countries, and an average growth forecast of about 3.9% to 2030. But our population is growing at 2.5%. So in other words, GDP per capita will increase by about 1.4%. This is not, things really need to change if we are going to grow ourselves out of this. And I say again, growth is, we need to get serious about economic growth. We need governments that are committed to economic reform that unlocks growth. We just finished a study on the future of the Tunisian economy and the Algerian economy, two countries that have exceptionally large subsidies and inflexible systems and so on and so forth, really locked, in the case of Algeria, which was a middle-income country, upper middle-income country until earlier this year, into a low-growth trajectory. And we need to remember that what we face in Africa is we face the dual challenge of democratization and growth and economic transformation, which is quite different to the experience of the Asian tigers who first grew and then underwent, to a degree, except for China, their democratic transition. So this challenge of simultaneous growth and democratization presents African leadership, which we can all criticize with due justification, with huge challenges. I think Alex made the point about what is going to happen this next year. What is going to happen is we have something like, I think, elections in 14 countries in 2021. And what we have in Africa is we have thin democracy, what we refer to as electoral democracy. You don't have substantive democracy. And thin democracy, or democracy of motion rather than substantive democracy, does not really translate into more accountability or better growth. So I think that the next year or 2 or 3 are going to be tough. Democracy is going to be under pressure. Growth is going to be under pressure. Stability is going to be under pressure. And at the same time, we have to seize this moment to become really serious about economic growth. Yes, it needs to be inclusive and all those other things. But if we don't grow, then we can try the South African example. We are in a recession for the last 5-6 years. Average GDP per capita in South Africa will recover by 2026 to where it was in 2019. And that is with a hugely effort on redistribution. But because we have a state that stole significant amounts of money under Jacob Zuma and did not invest in growth, we can redistribute as much as we can, but focus really on structuring African economies for much more rapid growth. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Yaki, and thank you to all the panelists. We've come to the end of another Africa Sessions. So I will pass the baton back to Fonte for closing comments.
Thank you very much, Ashish. It's been fascinating. I would like to thank the audience, of course, who joined us today for this 6th Africa session of the Global Strategic Platform, which has been dedicated to Africa after COVID, Africa's Outlook 2021. I definitely owe a debt of gratitude as well to our distinguished panelists who definitely did not disappoint. Willeen, Alex, Raymond, and Yaki, I hope you would be joining these sessions again as we roll into the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th sessions. For the rich conversations which have raised, I would also like to thank you for the conversations which have raised real, clear, practical recommendations for how Africa can seize opportunities from the post-COVID global context. Today morning, I was reading an article which said 7,000 businesses in Senegal had shut down since the onset of COVID-19. And these were statistics from the National Agency for Demographics and Statistics in Senegal. That's a sobering reality. And in order to keep things really simple, I would like to draw on Raymond's assertion about harnessing organic complementarities to respond to the challenges on the horizon with a blend of recommendations which might be old but need to be developed and implemented in new ways, and which need to leverage the kinds of reflexes that we have developed in responding to the COVID-19 challenge. Firstly, from these discussions, I think partnerships are key, and these cut across different levels. Social contracts that frame relationships between states and societies in both centers and the marginal borderlands ought to be responsively recalibrated, guaranteeing sociopolitical protections for all. These protections are key because where the protections are frayed, we have seen the consequences in different borderlands from the Horn of Africa to West and Central Africa, the Lake Chad Basin, and the Sahel as well. We think, from the discussions as well, I think public-private partnerships and relationships ought to be harnessed beyond just the simple accentuation of corporate social responsibility, but to a redefinition of the public, which takes not just the elite out of the public, but relates to a broader public, African public, to benefit from these partnerships. And of course, multilateral relationships on the continental and global level are equally vital to deliver on the politics of vaccine distribution, access, and to reverse the trends already seen due to damages caused by COVID. Secondly, the political economy of recovery is going to remain a challenge. We have spoken about the sobering reality with Alex pointing out 3 cases of democratic consolidation on the continent. We have seen democratic reversals from Guinea to Cote d'Ivoire, and we're going to see more reversals, even if we're going to see a political transition taking place in a place like Niger over the next week. However, we need to also move beyond just the trade and aid debate to seize opportunities that would emerge from the full operationalization of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Africa should not just be perceived as a huge 1.3 billion consumer economy, but it should also be seen as a potential partner in moving the global supply chains and global production forward. And of course, the continent will need to move from crisis reaction to crisis preemption, because that shift in posture would actually make the continent more ready to deal with challenges that could emerge before they emerge, rather than trying to deal with the consequences of this crisis, which have become intractable, and which in many cases, if you look at West Africa today, the crisis in the Sahel threatens the coast. The crisis in the Lake Chad Basin is spreading as far out as Sudan and connecting northern to southern Africa as well, and the Central African Republic. So these are the realities that the continent is facing, and without moving from a reactive posture to a preemptive posture, there won't be sustainable solutions. Of course, we cannot forget the fact that it's important to invest in the foundational elements of socioeconomic liftoff. And this would need to take place against the backdrop of sobering and contracting economies, as we have seen with stagnating GDP growth for at least the next 3 years. This would require scaling, prioritization, and again, setting the right partnerships. So I would like to thank the organizing team as well. Ashish, thank you very much for wonderful moderation and for asking the right questions, being very provocative at times. And we have not necessarily got to the right, there's no right or wrong answers with these issues. So thanks for being provocative. Thanks, Salim, for co-chairing this event with me. Unfortunately, Chico could not be part of this event, but he's done a lot of work on the background, and we send our condolences to him as well. And to Joel Costa, who remained behind the scenes managing the microphones and ensuring that this event ran smoothly. Thank you very much. It's been an honor and a pleasure for the ISS to collaborate in organizing this event, and we are committing to collaborating in organizing future events as well on this on this network. So thanks to the audience who joined us from the four corners of the world, and I hope that you enjoyed the discussions as much as I did. And we would take this forward, and it would surely inform the next discussions as well. Thank you very much. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll do it again.
Very much.
Absolutely.